Today, we listen to Glass van Gelder. Glass holds a postdoctoral position here in Ghent at the history department, but also at the State Archives in Ghent. His research focuses on early modern political history and on political and diplomatic culture. He is currently investigating early modern coronations and inaugurations, and his talk for today is entitled Joyous Entries and Local Lordships in the Burgundian and Habsburg Netherlands.
Thank you, Delphine, for so kindly introducing me, and it's a pleasure that GEMS hosts this meeting, so thank you very much. Some of you might perhaps think, oh Lord, once again, a talk about joyous entries. We have a lot of that already. But I'm going to talk about a special type of joyous entries today, seigneurial joyous entries, which have so far largely been neglected by scholarship. Indeed, as you might know, in the last 20 years, there has been increased scholarly attention on pre-modern joyous entries, inaugurations, coronations, and similar investiture ritual. Historians, so here you can see just a small selection from the many titles that have appeared since the 1990s. Historians no longer consider these rituals as spectacles that were directed top-down to passive audiences, but quite the contrary, they are increasingly seen as focal points of intense negotiations between many stakeholders during the uncertain weeks between the death of a ruler and the full acceptance of his or her successor, or between the departure of an official and the advent of his replacement. In spite of the wide interest, there are still significant gaps in our understanding. And one of the main hiatuses is that scholars have always focused primarily on princely joyous entries. And these usually took place in capital cities. Today, in this paper, I will present another kind of investiture ritual, namely joyous entries on the level of the seigneury. Today, we thus deal with joyous entries in villages and in small towns. And I will argue that joyous entries were structural components of the seigneurial landscape in the Burgundian and Habsburg Netherlands. They carried legal as well as political meaning and offered benefits to the new lord or lady, to local office holders, and to the subjects. Seigneurial entries give us indications about the power relations between these groups and thus also about how seigneuries worked. It's not only in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries, that there were seigneurial joyous entries. There were also such entries in parts of France, in the Alps region, in Bohemia, in Eastern Germany, at least, but there were also regions where you did not have this kind of seigneurial investitures. But let's start with the very beginning. What is a seigneury? In Dutch, Heerlijkheid, in German, Grundherrschaft. Seigneuries were territories in which a private lord or lady exerted a set of economic and in some instances also governmental powers. Lords could administer justice, levy taxes, appoint village and parish dignitaries, enforce local regulation, and compel inhabitants to labor services. But the majority of lords and ladies could only exert some of these powers, and only up to a certain degree. In most cases, lords and ladies were men and women of flesh and blood. But legal persons such as abbeys or chapters or cities could also possess seigneuries. For example, the Bishop of Ghent was also Lord of Evergem, and the Burgomaster of Antwerp acted as Lord of Berchem, Deurne-Borgerhout, and Wellerijck. The size of seigneuries differed considerably. Some united several towns and villages, for example, the Duchy of Aarschot or the Barony of Nevele. More often, however, they consisted of one village or even less. In fact, many seigneuries were small plots of land with nothing more than a hamlet or some scattered farms. Now, my analysis is based on 81 solemn entrances that took place between 1433 and 1793 in the Burgundian and Habsburg Netherlands. Here you see an overview of all the cases that I have found. Although the tradition of seigneurial entries in Brabant goes back at least to the late 13th century. Now, I found most information in monographs on villages or towns and local historical journals, and to a lesser degree, I consulted archives. And these are two examples of the kind of sources that I use. These are actually reports by eyewitnesses about the festivities that took place at the occasion of the entries. The focus of my search was on the southern parts of the Low Countries. And the list of entries that I just showed you is representative in several respects. First of all, there is a chronological continuity with 13 cases from the 15th century, 20 from the 16th and 17th centuries each, and 28 from the 18th century. The examples cover the Burgundian, Spanish, and Austrian Habsburg periods. The majority of invested people were male, but in 14 cases, women were the main actors on stage. The social background of these lords and ladies is diverse too. There are high aristocratic houses such as Arenberg and Nassau and Croÿ de Merode. There are also lesser nobles such as De Loé, Daemens de Moerkerke, and there are recently ennobled burghers such as Wouter van Hecke and François Klaasman. And in my sample, there are also two seigneuries that belong to legal persons. Evergem, owned by the Diocese of Ghent, and the seigneury administered by St. Peter's Abbey in Ghent. So in several respects, the data I gathered is representative, but there are also two imbalances. First of all, a striking feature of my data is the share of so-called seigneurial towns, which you can see on this table. No less than 31 entries, or almost 40%, concerned towns with a private lord, even though seigneurial towns were only a small fraction of thousands of seigneuries scattered across the Netherlands. And there's also a geographical imbalance. Although the cases pertain to highly urbanized and densely populated regions such as Flanders, as well as to more rural territories such as Hainaut, one region, as you can see on this map, clearly stands out, and that is the Duchy of Brabant. No less than 54 of the Joyous entries found took place in Brabant, including all 15th century cases. And of course, this probably has something to do with Brabant's strong tradition of bilateral charters between the dukes and towns or estates, often also called Joyous entry charters. That's a tradition that goes back to the second half of the 13th century. Now let's then turn to the entries themselves. And in fact, they follow the model which we also find in other types of entries. There somehow seems to be a standard, perhaps even pan-European pattern, regardless of the authority involved. First of all, there is an organizational phase, but unfortunately, I have very little information about the organization. Most seigneuries were fiefs, and according to feudal law, every new fief holder needed to undertake some administrative steps before the competent feudal court. And this is one example for the fiefs of the Boisveld Koenigsegg family preceding the entries in Erps and Kwerps. A considerable part of the practical organization then occurred orally between the new lord and the local community. For example, in 1649, the villages of the Liberty of Turnhout negotiated about how to divide the expenses for the upcoming entry. Most preserved accounts start with a second phase, which is the welcoming phase. The welcoming of the new lord at the boundaries of the seigneury, usually by a guard of honor. In 1713, the older men and other dignitaries of Assenede, together with Saint Sebastian Shooters Guild, welcomed the new lord, Jean-François de la Faye, outside the village. In Beaumont, Middelburg in Flanders and Merelbeke, artillery salvos and church bells resounded. And the pageantry of the entry of the new prince and princess of Grimbergen in 1729 started as soon as they left their residences in Brussels. They embarked on a boat of the city, a boat decorated with banderols and tapestries and Brabant's coats of arms. And at the same time, there was the sound of trumpets and drums and hunting corns. When they disembarked, the Lord and Lady were welcomed by Grimbergen's officers of justice and police and 3 maidens on horseback. And these maidens held coats of arms of the family and of the land of Grimbergen, and also a gilded rod of justice. And that rod of justice is a symbol we see quite often in these seigneurial joyous entries. Once the new lord had arrived, he paraded through the village or town, usually with the parish church as his place of destination. And this is the processional phase. A combined procession of militiamen, older men, and local officials seems to have been common practice. And this very visible role of local dignitaries comes as no surprise. They were important stakeholders in the seigneurial system. They manned its key institutions and exerted the legislative, executive, and judiciary powers of the lords. Nevertheless, their position could be very delicate, having to find a balance between the interests of the lord and the interests of the villages. And as a result, this kind of ritual, these entries offered welcome opportunities to visualize their authority in front of the assembled villagers. And at times, these processions really were huge affairs. And I give you one example for the tiny village of Erps, a little bit east of Brussels. In 1722, there was a procession of 60 cavalrymen, trumpeters, drummers, 20 hussars, a cornet with a standard, 2 Turks with the coats of arms of the village of Erps and the Koenigsegg family, 2 brigadiers, 2 grenadier detachments, the militias of Erps and Kwerps under arms and with musical instruments, and finally the bailiff, aldermen, and tax administrators that accompanied the new count on his way to the church. At the churchyard, there was also a triumphal arch, and there were 22 pitch barrels burning. And unfortunately, I have found only few images about these seigneurial joyous entries. So any one of you who has more ideas or knows about images, I would be very glad if you could share them with me. So there are several entries with triumphal arches, but I only found an example from the Dutch Republic, so not from the Burgundian or Habsburg Netherlands. This is a triumphal arch in Breda, built at the occasion of the joyous entry of Willem IV of Orange as Lord of Breda in 1737. As soon as the cortege, the procession, arrived at the church, the liturgical phase started. It was actually common to have both a high mass and a Te Deum to thank God for the new Lord or Lady. Albertine of Egmond, who by her marriage in 1611 had become Lady of Valois and held her joyous entry in 1614, she also received holy water. And that's once again a gesture we find in several entries. This is one of the few joyous entries that left visible remnants still today. Above the entrance of the Valois castle, you can see this bas-relief with the coats of arms of the new lord and lady, and it was made and placed there at the occasion of this joyous entry. And what was the role of this liturgical phase? Well, its role was to sacralize the new lord or lady who now had God's blessing to rule. The church was usually, but not exclusively, the place where the oath swearing and confirmation of local privileges took place, which we could call the fifth phase. However, not all solemnities had the same quality. And it's the same actually for princely joyous entries. Because originally in the Middle Ages, a joyous entry was a series of symbolic acts, but the juridical core of it was a mutual oath swearing, an oath swearing between the sovereign, the prince, and the estates or the cities. In the 17th century, we see a change. From then onwards, we deal actually with two different kinds of ritual. On the one hand, those investiture rituals with an oath swearing, and these were henceforth called inaugurations. So they took place at the start of a new reign. On the other hand, from the 17th century onwards, there were from time to time new governors general coming to Brussels. And when they arrived, they received their own joyous entry procession, but it was without oath swearing. So from the 17th century onwards, we have inaugurations and mere joyous entries, I would say, inaugurations with mutual oaths, joyous entries without. So the question now is, how can we qualify seigneurial investitures? Well, in many cases, the new lord indeed confirmed local privileges. And these solemnities resemble princely inaugurations, so with oaths. In Dist, for example, in 1545, the new lady on the one hand, and the burgomaster, aldermen, town council, and townspeople on the other swore mutual oaths. And here you can see a free translation of the oath the new lady swore. In 1596, the new Duke of Aarschot swore oaths in Aarschot, in Heverlee, and in Rotselaar, while symbolically holding a rod of justice, a verge of justice. And the inhabitants of these three places, they swore in turn, they swore obedience to the new lord, and they acclaimed him, Vive le Duc d'Aarschot. Now, with these oaths, lords often confirmed or granted local privilege charters, which were usually called vrijheden, liberties. And the historian Bart Minnen found 61 village liberties in Brabant from the 12th to the 16th centuries, 34 of which had been granted by local lords, chiefly at the occasion of their entries. Actually, the act of issuing written charters containing the liberties and privileges of the inhabitants was thus far from unusual, but our examples all predate the mid-16th century and almost exclusively concerned seigneuries in Brabant. So Brabant really was something special in this respect. Moreover, there's a gradual decline of the oath swearing. In fact, for the 18th century, I only found 3 instances. 2 of them were unilateral oaths to the new lord in Merelbeke, Lemberge, and in Turnhout. And there were only bilateral oaths in 1729 in Grimbergen, once again in Brabant. Now, what was the impact of these oaths? did they serve as sufficient warrants against seigneurial power abuses? Did villagers refer to them when their rights were under fire? The phrasing of the oaths is general and probably also generic, but in general terms, they do refer to local privileges and liberties based on specific charters in the village coffins. A recent article by my colleague Tom de Waele suggests that villagers of Meerbeke in Brabant effectively relied on sworn oaths in a confrontation with their lord, Guillaume de Goux, in 1502. Tom's analysis shows that differences in power and authority notwithstanding, subjects could base their claims on joyous entry oaths, and that lords were willing to accept this line of reasoning. Nevertheless, there were also local joyous entries that lacked oaths, and these entries served as political rather than juridical acts. In these cases, the lord, local clergy, and secular village leaders honored each other with gifts and banquets. It was a ceremonial confirmation of loyalty and authority with the participants and the assembled villagers as the main audience. Now, all joyous entries, whatever their quality, gave rise to gift exchange and popular festivities, and this was the final stage. In 1457, the inhabitants of Diest offered their new lord, Jan of Nassau, precious silver vases. Once again, I do not have images of this, but I have a similar image from the Dutch Republic from 2 centuries later, where you can see villagers offering a cup to their new lord at the occasion of his inauguration. In Aarschot in 1596, the new duke was offered a banquet with 1,000 guilders. And in addition, and in Turnhout, in addition to 4,000 Carolus guilders, the new lady also received linen and cloth. Now, offering a tax to the new lord seems to have been an integral part of seigneurial joyous entries. A fair amount of pressure may have been common in these cases. But conversely, the new lord also tried to create goodwill with his subjects through gifts or concessions, and the aforementioned charters issued at the occasion of joyous entries can in some cases be regarded as gifts to the inhabitants. Now, banquets were another universal ingredient of investitures, and seigneurial entries were no exception. The banquets were, of course, restricted. Only local dignitaries and the retinue of the lord were allowed to attend. But the rest of the population was not forgotten. We should not forget that lords had only very small police corpses at their disposal. And therefore, it was essential to secure the village's goodwill and collaboration in order to claim seigneurial revenues and rights. Pleasing the population could be a highly beneficial instrument for the lord and the local leaders who wanted to preserve peace and tranquility. And there are many examples of new lords offering beer and wine to the villages at the occasion of these joyous entries. In Turnhout, there's another example of a new lady who awarded the prizes at the shooting competition. So this you can say that these joyous entries plunged the whole local community into a festive atmosphere. I have some more examples or some more images to show to you. This is, for example, a print on silk. This is a panegyric, a laudatory poem to the new lord in Moerkerk in Flanders, in the neighborhood of Bruges. This kind of poems, we find them also, or there are several examples I found in the archives of these kinds of panegyrics for new lords. And I only, got a hint that there is a painting depicting a joyous entry in Gelder a couple of days ago. I haven't found out yet where this painting currently is. Here you can see the joyous entry of the Lord and Lady of Gelder in 1768 at the occasion of Gelder's elevation as barony. What you can see right here in the background is the castle, of course. You clearly see also the coats of arms of the Lord and Lady, but you also see right here the people feasting, having having a good time with the dishes and so on. And this is one last image I wanted to show to you. Again, from the Dutch Republic, I found no similar medals for the southern parts of the Low Countries, but this is a medal commemorating a joyous entry in Vlissingen and Veer. And once again, you see the assembled crowd and the city hall with where the new Lord is being inaugurated or invested. Let's come to some conclusions. First of all, my data proves that seigneurial joyous entries were common in the Burgundian and Habsburg Netherlands, and that there was no decline in the early modern era. However, the nature of the entries changed. In the late Middle Ages and the 16th century, they gave rise to an explicit confirmation of privileges and liberties through oaths and liberty charters. But that tradition fell into abeyance in the 16th and 17th century. How can we assess these developments? There are two contradictory explanations we can think of. Firstly, we could conclude that seigneurial power grew stronger over time. In this scenario, the Lord did not need to grant liberties or swear oaths any longer. Thus, the villagers lost important warrants for their rights and customs. On the other hand, the gradual disappearance of oaths and charters might also mirror the weakening of the Lord's position, and that's the second scenario. Perhaps there were less oaths and liberty charters because villages did not need them anymore. In 18th century Brabant, for example, villages increasingly and successfully turned to the Council of Brabant, the highest law court, to fight seigneurial power abuses. Moreover, many of the examples in my analysis concern absent lords who seldom visited their seigneuries. Absentee lordship required the delegation of power to local officials, one group which certainly benefited from the entries which bestowed them with prestige and authority. And the survival of seigneurial entries may thus also be a testimony of the weakness of seigneurial power in the Habsburg Netherlands and the need to gain the goodwill of local communities in order to effectively control and manage the seigneury. But we need more research about the relationships between lord and villagers in order to formulate definitive conclusions. But regardless of which of the two explanations mentioned above or just mentioned is valid, joyous entries helped stabilize the seigneurial system, and this remained the case even when reciprocal oaths and charters became less common. And it is telling in that respect, and that's the last thing that I'm going to say, it is telling in that respect that a considerable number of the entries, about 20% of them, and 7 out of 14 or 50% for Flanders, concern lords and families that were new in the seigneury. And these newcomers may have felt a ritualized possession taking to be particularly necessary to obtain authority and define their rights and duties. And this shows once more how powerful these entries remained in the early modern era. Thank you.